I'll send to this now. Legislation prohibiting the use of scab labor. Labour Minister Bell says scab labor ConCourt judgment delivered last week was a discussion which first started in 1995. He says the ruling will protect striking workers and not undercut them through replacement during lockouts. The matter relates to a dispute between the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and logistics company Trenstar, which saw workers going on strike for weeks in 2020. Bell joins us now to elaborate a bit further. Terry, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time tonight.
Good evening, Davo.
We'll get into Section 76 in a moment, but let's start here. The labour policy and legislation environment in South Africa, would you say it promotes mutual well-being or common well-being? Does it encourage free collective bargaining and constructive settlement of disputes?
I think it's among the best in the world. It's pretty good labour legislation. And in 1995, there were a small group of us, including myself, who actually were very worried about the inclusion of the section which allowed for replacement labour, which actually effectively undermines the whole question of the right to strike, which is a fundamental constitutional right. And we raised that issue, and in fact, some of us, including myself, called it a scab clause. And over the years, there have been a few sort of niggles about it, but it has continued. And finally, over this one issue, over NUMSA taking this one issue to court, finally we've had a change. But in fact, it undermined the entire basis of the idea of the right to strike, which is the only weapon in the final analysis that workers actually have, the only lever that they have to exert to gain their rights, both financially and in terms of conditions of employment, etc.
Yeah, we have Section 76 in the real terms as far as the Labour Relations Act is concerned in South Africa. In other parts of the world, like Canada and some parts of the United Kingdom, they speak of anti-scab legislation. Are we even close to that?
No, Britain in particular has had some really peculiar anti-union legislation come in of recent times. And in the United States, you've also got some, I'm not that au fait with Canada, but in the United States, you've also got some very anti-union procedures. For example, there's a big thing at Amazon at the moment. Amazon, the major sort of, as we know who Amazon are, their truck drivers have finally, who've been delivering things, they wear Amazon vests, they drive Amazon laden trucks, etc., and they have won a union right, a right to form a union, and they've actually done a deal with the company saying they will increase their rate from $20 to $30 an hour. Fantastic, except that Amazon now turn around and say, but you see, they're not really employed by Amazon, they're employed by a subsidiary company that is contracted to Amazon. So you've got all these sort of devices that are going on around the world. We haven't quite reached that level here yet, but we already have what I would call part of the gig economy, people who are living in, perilous work. They may be working for one day here, another day there, or part-time, or just use your own scooter and get yourself out and to make deliveries, and for that we'll pay you for each delivery.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to organize workers like that. Problematic for unions, but it's time that the unions woke up to the fact that the world of work has changed and is changing very rapidly.
Why was Section 76 left to interpretation, do you think?
I think there was a push by employers who were worried about, they said it was far too friendly. Oops, there we go. I have just put on some other light if I can find it. Sorry.
All right, Terry Bell, they will give you a moment to get your light on. There you go. All right.
Oh, yeah, I've got it. It's a pretty rough light. It's just a solar light. But anyhow, I think the employers were very worried. They did at the time say this was too friendly to labour. It wasn't friendly to labour. It merely slightly evened the playing field. It made for labour legislation, which I think in international terms ranked as very good. But they did not want that. And in fact, if they got the scab labour clause in, what it meant was if you had a strike, you then declared a lockout, you could then employ replacement labour. We had the terrible situation in Edendale, and I don't know if anyone remembers that far back, in the 1980s, the longest strike in South African history, where a whole group of more than 1,000 at BTR in just outside Pietermaritzburg went on strike, were then locked out, and they brought in a complete scab labor force, undercut everything. It was the most revolting situation. They finally won it after many years, but a lot of deaths along the way and a lot of hardship. So we've come a long way, and at least that's the one little victory we have for this May Day, which has been a very sad May Day, because the unions are much more fragmented, much weaker than they were 5 or even 10 years ago.
So let's talk about that. I mean, I'm reading some debates around it and some arguments, and I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, essentially, what you're saying, I have a garden, right? I hire someone to come and do my garden, and I say, I'll pay you $50. 6 months down the line, they decide, no, $50 is not enough. I want $70. And I say, no, that is too much. I can't give you $70. And they say, well, you can't get rid of me and you can't find a replacement. Is that in line with what is competition in the world? Others are saying the effect of that is pretty much to protect labor unions from market forces that everyone in the world has got to contend with. In other words, competition.
No, that's not true at all. In fact, the employers don't really compete that much. They collude with one another to ensure that they can keep wages down. One must never forget, and your example is not a good example on that sort of level between individuals and working in a household. Let's talk about the economy generally. The employer who owns a business, may not even work in the business, but owns it, has one priority, and that is to maximize profit. The workers who create the goods or whatever the services are there to produce them in order for the bosses to make the profit from them. So they should be the ones who should actually also benefit. Now, if there's greater productivity, which has been happening because of advances in technology, it has not been the workers who have benefited. It's usually been the employers. And sometimes these are employers who don't even live here. They may live in some other country and they happen to own the business and they put some managers in place. And their priority is profit. The priority of the workers is merely to gain enough to feed, clothe, house adequately and live decently as families in the working areas of the country. Yeah. Now, those are contradictory because on the one hand, if you increase wages or benefits, it means you erode profit. So you will always have what is known in classic terms as class war. It does exist. The way you get out of it, of having conflict, is by having negotiation. And that's where trade unions come into being, and that is where negotiation comes into being, and it's compromises that are made. Now, when you do a deal, you sign the deal, you sign it, and that's it. We agree to this because we'll withhold our labor, which you need, unless you do a deal. No union is going to ask for too much in order to crash the company because that means they lose their jobs. So it's a complete nonsense to talk that way about unions trying to destroy the economy. They want to build the economy in order to build themselves as well.
Now, the other argument that they raise around this is the very same argument that you're saying, that to build a company is expensive. Now you're holding entrepreneurs hostage via saying that, well, you can't find replacement if we are on a strike.
No, because the point is, why is there a strike in the first place? If you have a company that is making vast profits and workers who are finding it difficult to feed their families, to clothe their families, and this is the situation now, the majority of working people who are a minority probably in this country now, particularly if you're under the age of 30, there's up to 60, 70% unemployment. If you're having difficulty feeding your family and you have a boss creaming off millions or billions, no, that's not fair. It's not only not fair, it's not sustainable, because you're eventually going to cause incredible social dislocation. So what you need is you sit down, you have a negotiation. And if it doesn't come to it, your final force, the bosses have most of the power. They can use their financial power. They can use their power through the media, all that sort of thing. The final thing is you say, we'll withhold our labor until you talk to us decently. Declare your books. Show your books openly. This is what many companies do not do. They hide their books. We need an open, transparent society, an accountable society where the employers are totally accountable and unions and workers are also accountable. If we have that sort of situation, you have transparency, you can have open, honest negotiations where a fair share of the profits made by workers go to the workers. And you don't have a tiny group, often just a parasitic group, who merely own shares and sit at home and take the dividends. No, we've got to have a fairer sort of system, and that's all that the unions stand for, and that's the strike is the only means you can use to achieve that.
In your experience with where scabs have been involved, do the disputes go on for longer?
Very much so, and unfortunately they often get very, very violent. And where I'm going back now, I can go back and give you more than 100 years of that sort of thing. There are even songs about the black-legged labor miner from Durham in England, where we string a wire across the road to decapitate him. I mean, because people saw that as stealing the food from your children's mouth. These were people who were selling their labor, often cheaper in the long run than the workers were working for. The employers can play one desperate group of workers against another. They can play the racial game, which was played in this country brilliantly. 1922, the fact is you had this massive, almost a civil war, where you had white miners standing up and saying, workers of the world unite for a white South Africa. They played against black miners. In the United States, you had Italian miners pitted against Polish miners. You had Irish miners pitted against black miners or African American miners. So these divide and rule tactics have been used, and I can understand it. The boss's priority is to make the maximum profit. And to make the maximum profit, you've got to get the most out of your workers, or the most out of your productive capacity, be it run by workers running machines or whatever. So therefore, their interest is opposed directly to the interests of the people they employ. It's a contradiction, and the only resolution, unless you change the system, is to sit down and negotiate. And if the employer refuses to budge, the only power the workers have is their labor power and the withdrawal of that power.
Yeah. Do you think then, therefore, Section 76, as it sits now, has real teeth in the sense to force companies to come and reason and bargain constructively, force companies also to feel some economic pain?
Well, no, they do. They bark all the time. I mean, you have, unfortunately, we never hear these. We always have the concentration on strikes. Mostly there are no strikes. Most wage negotiations, year in and year out, are settled. There's no problem or anything. We have had one recent case where the government reneged grossly, and I think it was immoral. It was technically not illegal, and that was when they pushed the majority of the public sector unions into signing a 3-year deal, which the unions didn't want, but the government insisted. And then, having signed this deal, at the third year, they reneged on it and said, we're not paying it, which completely undermined collective bargaining, which is the basis we're talking about in terms of negotiation in order to avoid a strike. So the best way forward is to be open, honest, and collectively bargain within the system. And until and unless we change the system, that's all we've got. And now, fortunately, scab labor is in South Africa out. And I think that is something to be welcomed, because it creates a lot of tension, a lot of difficulty, and in a country such as ours, which is violent enough already, it's not a good idea to have that clause still on the books.
Yeah. Interesting that you raise that, because on one of the debates, one of the questions that was raised is exactly that, this question of violence, saying that part of what causes violence in the picket lines is that unions break picket laws, and they, for example, would do something like what we saw just now recently with Nehau blocking ambulances, for example, from going into hospitals, and blocking doctors and so on and so forth, saying, but how can we want to add more laws that restrict the employer when the current laws that are there people are not adhering to anyway?
Well, the point was that I would actually argue, and I think all of us did, and I wrote about it, that what Nehau did was absolutely ridiculous. It had nothing whatever to do with the hospitals that they were blockading. What on earth they decided to do, therefore, no one knows. Who's the employer? The employer is not the nurses who are working in the hospitals, not the patients, working-class patients. They didn't blockade the private hospitals. They should have gone to the employer. They should have sat in the Ministry of Health's office and said, we're not leaving this office until you fix things up. We have a situation now, Baragwanath, where there's no food for the patients. We have already, by the government's own admission, 88,000 nurses too short in this country. I mean, it's an appalling situation that the government and the ministers are responsible. Why on earth, Nehau? I think there's a problem, and the problem comes back again to politics. The fact that the major union federation, COSATU, is still a part of an ANC-led alliance, and the ANC is in government. This was an argument that goes back to 1993, when there was a big argument at the COSATU Congress, 92, 93, I can't remember the exact year, where it was said, look, the ANC is going to become the government. The government is the biggest employer in the land. Therefore, unions should not be involved and in bed, effectively, with bosses, with employers. But they did. And I think that was a disastrous mistake. Instead, what happened was a conveyor belt began to develop, where good union leaders moved up the ranks of the union, then moved seamlessly across into parliament and ministerial posts. The Minister of Labour today, Truls Messi. He was the former General Secretary of SADTU. We had Zokwana, who was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, who notoriously underpaid his own farm workers. And then they moved seamlessly from there into big business. Our own president's a classic example. So, I mean, you don't want that. What you want are democratic, transparent unions which are accountable, where the leadership is totally accountable, dealing with employers who open their books, talk honestly and openly, and work together within this system, while there is this constant tension between the two because of the conflicting interests, one wanting to make more profit, the other one wanting to benefit more from what they actually produce and do.
Terry Bell, much appreciated as always. Thanks so much for coming on. Labour analyst there, Terry Bell, helping us in that conversation.